I'm very excited to welcome Adam Bryant today. This is all part of my Leadership Legacy Summit in June, and I'm thrilled to be interviewing Adam today. Adam joined Merrick & Company, an executive mentoring firm, as managing director in 2017 after a 30-year career in journalism, including 18 years at the New York Times. In addition to his many roles there as a reporter and editor, he created the weekly Corner Office column in 2009, interviewing 525 CEOs and other leaders over a decade, and wrote 2 books based on the themes that emerged from those interviews. Since joining Merrick, he has started popular interview series on LinkedIn with board directors, CEOs, CHROs, and writes a monthly column on leadership for Strategy and Business magazine. His next book, which he is writing with former Amgen CEO Kevin Scher, is The CEO Test, Mastering the Challenges That Make or Break All Leaders, and will be published early next year by Harvard Business Review Press. Adam also is the senior advisor to the Reuben Mark Initiative for Organizational Character and Leadership at Columbia University. Well, welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Jann. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thank you very much. You've interviewed leaders, as I said, for a decade with the New York Times, and I would have my undergraduate students, I required them to read it every week. Now I have my graduate leadership students read it every week. And then I started having them read you on LinkedIn. So, you've got 2 books, another one coming out. What have been some of the themes that have emerged across these 3 books throughout these hundreds of interviews?
Sure. Happy to answer that. And again, thank you for the invitation. It might be helpful to take 60 seconds just to provide some context for everybody who's watching today, just in terms of my approach to interviewing leaders. So, I really got started with Corner Office, which is a series I started at the New York Times back in 2009. And it was based on a very simple what if, which is, what if I sat down with CEOs and never asked them a single question about their companies? And instead just asked them about kind of timeless questions about leadership lessons they learned over the course of their lives and how they learned it and how they think about culture and teams and hiring and career advice. And so, and that's a very different focus, because most of the time when people sit down with CEOs to interview them, it's very much, the questions are often like, what's your growth plan, right? Like, how are you going to grow the company? What are the industry dynamics and what are the trends in your industry? Mm-hmm. And that's fun. I mean, I did a lot of those interviews myself. There's a big audience for them, but I had this kind of very singular focus of trying to understand who these CEOs were, what made them tick and how they did their job and how they thought about leadership, and really trying to find kind of the stories behind it, the insights. And from the very start, I, set myself some guidelines that I was going to embrace diversity in every sense of the word, race, gender, nationality. And I was always just going to interview people as leaders, not as female leaders, not as African-American leaders, kind of get rid of all the adjectives in front of that word that you hear and just ask them essentially the same questions, open-ended questions. So that was the context, and it really just started with this what if idea, and it's now led to, by now I've interviewed more than 600 CEOs, and I never went into this. I didn't know where it was going to go, and I didn't really plan to write books either. But at some point, it's not quantitative data, it's qualitative data, but at some point you have enough of it, over by now, it's kind of 6 million words of transcripts, that clear patterns emerge. Sure. And my, the books I've written have really been trying to kind of spot those patterns. And very often the books were inspired by a question rather than waking up one morning and having an idea. And the question behind my first book was like, what is it about these people that explains why they got to the top, which is a different question than asking people what the secret to success is. Because if you do that, you're going to get some variation of hard work and perseverance, right? But if you frame the question more narrowly and say, like, what are the X factors that explain why somebody gets promoted over others all the way to the top? That's a very specific question. My second book was trying to understand, like, what are the biggest drivers of culture? And the book that I'm working on right now, called The CEO Test, it's rather than focusing on what's unique about the CEO job, asking, well, what do they do that all leaders do? I mean, obviously there's more complexity and consequences if you're the CEO, but what muscles are they working that all leaders work, and what can we learn from them? So that's been kind of the focus. So with that context, you know, I have to say that over time, a few themes have become only clearer. And you know, I captured in the first book, but there's this habit of mine that I called a simple mindset in the first book. But it comes down to this ability to simplify complexity. And I've really come to appreciate just how important that art form is for a leader, to take, you know, all the elements of your company, all the industry dynamics. You think about where the world is going to be in 5 years, where your industry is going to be in 5 years, how you're going to win in that environment, sort of that time machine, and what it looks like. And to just come up with, for lack of a better term, in our consulting firm, you know, we just call it like, what's your simple plan?
Sure.
Right? Like what's your big goal? What are the 3 big things you're going to do to achieve that? What are the big challenges, and how you're going to measure progress? And that may sound simple, but it is a really tough art form that a lot of people struggle with, because, you know, it's just, I'm finding in my experience, and this is reinforced by the CEOs and board directors and other people I interview, but just this ability to answer the question, like, what is your simple plan? A lot of people struggle with that, as hard as it may seem. And, you know, a big part of my understanding of the context of this, I realized that the word strategy is kind of a Rorschach test. It's like a classic ink blot where, you know, I didn't go to business school. I spent my career as a journalist, but I was kind of assumed that if you said the word strategy, that everybody kind of knew what that meant exactly. We all had a clear understanding, just like people would, you know, this is a coffee cup. We all know what that looks like. But it turns out that's not the case. So, you know, what I've come to understand is, you ask people, you know, what your strategy is, and some people will go to a very high altitude and they'll talk about kind of mission and vision, or really just describe what the company does rather than where it's going. Other times you ask people what the strategy is, and they'll go very granular, kind of down in the weeds, and talk about their 10 initiatives for this quarter. But there is this kind of like middle layer that a lot of people struggle with. Just this, you know, again, it sounds simple, but simple is hard. Just to be able to stand up in front of your employees and say, like, this is where we're going and this is how we're going to get there. And again, sounds simple, but it's very hard. A lot of people struggle with it. And that has just been a theme that's been so consistent throughout, and has been kind of an ongoing revelation for me. And, you know, almost to the point where when you see people who do it really well, I mean, one example that I'm going to be using in my next book is Bob Iger at Disney. Mm-hmm. Right, from the day he got his job, and he campaigned on an internal platform. He talks about this in his book, which is very good. But he was working with somebody to sort of make the case to the board about why he should get the job. And that person said to Bob Iger, it's like, you need to simplify your plan. And so from, you know, to lobby for the job, and from the day he got the job, he's been pushing 3 things, which is like technology and kind of platforms in all its form, global expansion, and great content. And over his career, like all the big moves that have grown Disney, they've all been those 3 things. And what's so interesting, I find, is that when people do it well, and again, he's one of many examples, but when you find somebody like that who does it well, you know, you look at Bob Iger's 3 things and you go, well, like, isn't that obvious? Like, that seems so simple, right? But like, that's the beauty of it.
Right.
Right? He's made it sound simple.
Uh-huh.
And it has been this kind of, you know, the driving growth of the company. So that's been like such a key art form. And again, I you know, for a company to succeed, it has to start, you know, I think of it as like the cornerstone of a foundation in a house. Mm-hmm. There has to be that clarity around those simple questions, like, where are we going? How are we going to get there? What are the challenges? How are we going to measure progress?
Right. Excellent. Well, again, you know, I highly recommend your books. And what I really liked about your interviews in the New York Times, Sunday New York Times, is you often talked about culture, and I'm a big culture person. And then I loved how you kind of always closed with, what advice would you give to college graduates?
Yeah.
So we might close with that, given what's going on now. But kind of your graduation speech here.
Yeah.
But, you know, as I said, you continue to interview, write these articles, interviews on LinkedIn. What are just some other themes? I mean, I think you're right, you know, strategy, and it sounds simple and three things, but it's not. What are some other themes that have emerged?
Sure. It's kind of a close cousin of developing the simple plan, because what I tell people is, like, when they finally develop one, you know, I will say to them, congratulations, you are now half done.
Yeah.
Because the job is then to communicate it. And I think it's you know, I've heard this from so many CEOs, that a big part of their learning curve as they were, you know, growing up as leaders, was coming to understand that you do have to repeat yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very easy to fall into a trap of, like, why do I need to talk about the strategy again? You know, we did it 3 weeks ago at the all hands meeting, like, everybody knows it. And the point is, you have to.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just a whole bunch of reasons. And you know, the best CEOs understand this. It's almost like being a politician, in that it's not like you give the exact same stump speech, but you have to remind people of kind of the core principles, and keep coming back to those things. Yeah. I heard a great expression from one CEO, it really stayed with me. He said, you know, never leave people a vacuum, because, you know, they'll fill it with a lot of stuff,
Yes.
a lot of junk. If you don't communicate, people's imaginations will kind of run away with them. And very often they'll go to a dark place.
Yes.
And very often, you know, sometimes the smarter the person, the more elaborate, you know, the scenario that people can paint. And so you have to provide that counterweight of, like, just constant communication. Because again, if you leave that void, people will fill it. And I just interviewed, there's a great story that really brought this to life. Tom Lawson, who runs an insurance company called FM Global. But he told the story when he was in an operating role. I think he was in charge of the R&D center or something. He had, like, a really bad morning. You know, it was sort of fought with his teenage son, got late, 45-minute commute, was pouring, you know, got the last parking spot and didn't have an umbrella. So he gets into work. He's drenched. He's late for a call. Sort of barrels past the receptionist and then closes his door. And after the conference call, he leaves his door closed for 3 hours. And then there's a knock on the door from one of his lieutenants and says, like, is everything okay? And it was the day that the earnings came out, and everybody had assumed, based on his body language, rushing by, people started talking, and all these kind of, like, we're going bankrupt, we're going to get sold, you know, something's terrible is about to happen. And for him, it was just a real light bulb moment of, you've got to be so aware of your, you know, your body language, and just, and it's happened to me in my years as a manager. You know, I learned a couple of important lessons just about, you know, how you carry yourself, and just to be constantly aware of that. There's also a good rule of thumb that I heard from one CEO. Basically, you have to give yourself permission for people to make fun of you, because you're repeating yourself so often. Like, if they're teasing you, that it gets to the point that they're teasing you, that they know exactly what you're going to say before you say it. Like, the crazy thing is, like, that's a complete victory, right?
Yes,
because
exactly.
you have to say things like 7 times to get people to hear you once.
Yeah.
And I think the final rule of communication that I keep in mind, and the credit for this goes to the CEO of a company called Guidewire, but my shorthand for what he said, it's kind of the Einstein theory of communication. And what he said is that, you know, you can have a room full of Einsteins, like the smartest people on the planet, but there's some quirk of the human brain that the bigger the audience, the more the collective IQ drops.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's just it's a good reminder to yourself. Like, again, you may know the people individual in the audience, and they may all be wicked smart, but there's something about, you know, the human condition that the bigger the audience, the more the IQ drops collectively. And it just forces you to focus on like a few bullet points, big
Yes.
font, short sentences, keep it simple.
Right.
So, between developing the simple plan and then, over communicating it and keeping the communication simple, those are a couple of things that are so important that a lot of people struggle with. And the final point I'll make about communication is, just this notion, and we see it a lot in our consulting work right now, that very often for the CEO, the leader, the CEO can often think that the plan is as clear to everybody as it is to him or her. Mm-hmm. And often it's not, right? It's clear in their head, but we've been through situations where we can interview like the 10 people or 8 people on somebody's leadership team and ask them like, I'd love to hear in your own words, like, what's the strategy? And you can hear a lot of different answers. And so that's like just an important reminder of this idea, like, make sure it's clear to everybody. Like, can it pass the hallway test, as I call it? If you stop somebody to come in a hallway and say, what's our strategy? Would you hear 12 different answers or the same answer from 12 people?
Right. No, I like that a lot. I did some research where I interviewed college presidents. And again, I remember this college president, he said, you have to flood the organization with information, because in the absence of information, they make it up.
Yeah.
And that's the rumor mill. So, I mean,
right.
You're absolutely right on. And absolutely. Let's talk about leadership for the pandemic. How do you think this situation now is going to change how leaders will act, should act? What advice would you give them?
Sure. Well, I think to set the context, and a lot of people are coming up with models sort of for how to, how companies are dealing with this crisis. And I do think there are 3 kind of phases to it. The first one is like, and they've almost broken down by month. I mean, my colleagues and I often talk about some phenomenon we will say to each other that feels so March, right? Like things change every month so distinctly. And I think March was that moment where, businesses kind of, it's like we all got hit by the tsunami, right? You just, everybody got broadsided by it. And so there's this initial sense of like, can we recover, right? And just reacting in the moment. Is everybody safe? Can we get everybody working at home? And then it became, April was more like, can we continue operating? Is this Zoom thing going to work? Can people still be productive? How are we going to get work done? Oh, it looks like we're getting work done. And I think the conversations I'm having now with a lot of leaders, I think the sort of collective mood ring that people are feeling is like, okay, now let's look ahead. And, I think the big challenge for companies right now is to be asking themselves questions like, what can we do now so that we can accelerate coming out of this crisis? Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a cliche of never waste a good crisis, but it is an important reminder that there is opportunity here. And a lot of it just goes back to that sort of simple whiteboard exercise of going back to first principles. Like, if we were creating the company today, what would we do differently? Mm-hmm. Right? This is an opportunity to rethink internal processes, to imagine the future, which is probably going to be more digital and virtual, and what customers need there. But again, just that kind of forcing function of, let's take this moment to reimagine what this company could be and how we operate together, because it's very hard to, transformations are particularly difficult when in good times, right? Mm-hmm. When companies are doing, when everything is sort of fine, like that is the toughest time to do a transformation as a leader, and pull that up, because people are they're like antibodies. They just kind of, rise up, and it's like, why? We don't want, everything's fine. Why do we need to change? Everything's working. And so you have to take advantage of these moments, because we have disruption, right? And as one of the CEOs I interviewed, Sharon Daniels, said, disruption creates motion, right? It creates energy. So how do you take that energy and use it as, kind of like a tailwind to help accelerate you? And I think that's a really important insight. I've also been, a new theme that has come up pretty recently. It's kind of the silver lining of this crisis in terms of what it's meant for companies. I mean, let's acknowledge the, incredible health and economic toll and damage that this pandemic has created, like full stop. But what I'm hearing from a lot of leaders is that there's not only have they been pleasantly surprised, but there's a sense that people within their companies are being pleasantly surprised by how people are reacting in this crisis. And not only sort of building new muscles or working underutilized muscles, but there's a sense of like, wow, like we can do this stuff. And, a great example is when this pandemic hit, all of a sudden everybody had to shift to remote working.
Yes.
Right. And people have said to me, and it makes sense intuitively, that in quieter times, like the prospect of that, shifting everybody to working from home, those of us who are in this kind of knowledge workers per se, like that would take 18 months, right? It would take weekly meetings. It would take, committees and subcommittees and teams. And, half of the meetings would people saying, we can't do this, we shouldn't do this, find all the reasons why we can't do it. And yet companies did it in like 2 days.
And colleges and universities and churches. Right. Yeah.
Right. So there's that kind of, there's a sense of, a lot of this stuff is no longer kind of academic. We can sort of say, well, look at what we just did. And I think it's not just that. I mean, I think another big theme that has emerged, companies really struggle in good times with prioritization, right? Sort of, gets back to what I was talking about, that simple plan. Like, what are the 3 big things we're going to focus on to drive this strategy? A lot of companies, a lot of teams have trouble with that because you feel like you're doing your job better the longer that list is. Like, well, I have 10 priorities because I'm ambitious and I've got my arms around the company. But this crisis has been kind of a forcing function on prioritization, because in the crisis, you have to say, all right, what are the things that really matter? Like, right. Really, like what are the things that really matter right now? And everything else is going to get pushed to the back burner. And
it's kind of a near-death experience.
It is. But that muscle of prioritization that everybody struggles with in good times, everybody's using that now, right? This woman, Sharon Daniels, she runs a company called Aria, and she starts every meeting with, what's our focus today? And like, that's a great tactic. And it also makes you wonder, shouldn't everybody be doing that every day? Even when we're beyond the crisis. So, and also like speed of innovation. I'm hearing a lot of stories from companies where it's not like we got to wait till this is perfect. It's like, we're having meetings every day. We're making decisions every day. We expect prototypes. Let's just get out in the marketplace. The customers will tell us what's working, what's not, we'll improve it. You're seeing so many case studies of just incredible speed of innovation. So I think there's this collective sense right now that I'm hearing strands of is, how do we bottle this?
Right.
The speed of decision, my prioritization, fast innovation, all these things, how can we hold on to it? I mean, right now, a lot of companies are working at surge capacity. You can't, operate 100% all the time, but a lot of companies are trying to figure out, how do we hold on to this? So those are some of the other themes. I mean, I also think this has been an incredible moment for leadership and just ultimately changing the nature of leadership. I don't know if you'd like to go there, but
actually that kind of leads into my next question. Sure. So I do want to say that for anyone listening, if you want to put questions in the chat, we'll have time at the end to answer some questions. So please feel free to, enter your questions in the chat. Well, I mentioned that I'm a big culture person. And so I also believe in servant leadership. And the way I define it is leaders should clear obstacles, not be the obstacle.
Yeah.
And so do you think in this pandemic that another silver lining or opportunity is people really realize that, compassion, understanding, empathy, that these are characteristics that matter to people, and that they can be effective leadership skills?
Yeah, I really think so. I mean, I think this crisis has been kind of I think and I hope that it will be seen as kind of a nail in the coffin for command and control leadership. Just, one of the sad facts about, life is that there are still too many bad bosses out there. And, a big flavor of the bad boss is just like, do what I say, right? I have all the answers. You're just an asset to help me look good. So don't ask, but just do what I say. And you can't do that now, right? And anybody who thinks they have the answers in the middle of this crisis doesn't. Especially that people are working remotely, that there's such a demand for kind of compassion, humanity, and understanding. There's a sense that we're all in it together. And I think that it's putting a premium on new skills. I see a couple of those, it struck me the other day that any leader who feels uncomfortable uttering the words, "I don't know," in a meeting, like, you need to get over that, right? Because this is the time as a leader to say, we've got this problem. I don't know what the answer is. I'd love to hear some ideas from the team on how we approach this. Yeah. Like, this is the time, and that people talk about it in terms of humility and vulnerability. A lot of leaders struggle with that because there's a bit of the imposter syndrome. They want to give the impression that they have all the answers. Like, that is just not gonna fly.
Right.
So I think that's a key point. I've also been asking a lot of chief human resource officers and also CEOs how this crisis, coming out of it, what are the leadership skills that they're going to put a greater premium on, right? Because when you're looking at the succession pipeline, the high potentials, the people in your development programs, like, what is really going to matter? Like, what are you looking, not only assessing and training, but what are you looking for? Those X factors to separate people you're going to promote.
Excellent question.
And I think a lot of what I'm hearing, it really comes down back to this idea of being able to embrace ambiguity. Mm-hmm. We heard about that before. People were talking about that, they're talking agility, but this idea of being comfortable in the gray, because everything's gray now, right? We don't know, like, how long it's going to last, how deep, what the next normal is going to be. So it really is, to me, that's a key thing, that is, when people, and when ambitious people think, like, how can I separate myself? If I want to get promoted and move up in an organization, what are the skills that I need to show that really matter? I think just being comfortable at it, and also, especially now where so much work is distributed and remote work, and if there's more innovation going on, like, just having people who follow you, who don't report to you, to me, like, that's a key test. It's easy to get people who report to you to do things, but, do you have the leadership skills? Do you have the influence to get to, mobilize people and get them to do things that don't report to you? So to me, those are the things that people are going to be, like, I think one of the lasting impacts of this pandemic is that's going to matter more.
Yeah, that's interesting, because when you said that, it reminded me, Peter Drucker used to say that if you really want to be a leader, learn in volunteer organizations because they don't have to follow you.
Right.
So that's interesting. Well, good. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit. And again, I want to encourage people to put questions in the chat. But an area that I'm very passionate about now is this whole idea of legacy and leaders' legacy. And so these are questions that might seem a little different to you, but how do you define legacy and what's it mean to you?
Sure.
Even when you hear the word.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the context of sort of CEOs, which is my kind of swim lane, if you will, I'll give you a short answer and then a longer answer, but ultimately, if I boil it down, it's really about, like, do you leave the place better than when you found it, right? So that's my short answer. The longer answer, I'm going to cash in my chit to use this one sports analogy if I could.
Okay.
I don't want to overuse sports analogies, but if I could use one,
That's okay.
you know, I think it's important to understand how the CEO sees him or herself. And the sports analogy I use is, you think of a football team.
Mm-hmm.
You know, key people on a football team are like the quarterback, the coach, the general manager, and the owner of the team, right? So you think about those four people, and I think what distinguishes them from each other is kind of their time horizon, right? So I think there's a flavor of CEO who is like the quarterback. They see themselves as the quarterback, because quarterback statistics are measured and sliced and diced a million ways, right? And a quarterback will measure their career based on things like how many touchdowns they threw, games won, right? It's sort of statistics. The metaphorical equivalent of the CEO is like the stock chart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that kind of CEO. You know, a coach has a longer term horizon, and some CEOs see themselves that way. And it's not like one or the other, like they're overlapping, but who do you see yourself more of? And the general manager may outlast the coach, right? They've got a longer, how am I building the team for like the next 5 years, not just this season, right? It's ultimately about time horizon. And then the owner of the team has the longest time horizon, right? And in many ways is in the background, but you know, they are trying to think like, how do I build, you know, the culture and infrastructure of the company so that we create like a legacy of winning that ideally goes on for decades. And so to me, I think that's a useful metaphor for understanding the context of CEOs, like how they view legacy. Because I will tell a story. I did meet a retired CEO once, and it was a small detail, but it really stayed with me. He had a laminated card in his shirt pocket that he showed me. And it was basically a summary of his financial performance when he was CEO. And he kept this in his shirt pocket all the time. It was like literally next to his heart. And it really struck me, because he saw him, it was the quarterback model. It's like, when I was in the chair, I delivered, you know, this much growth in stock price or earnings or whatever the measure is. And to me, like, that's kind of the narrowest. So to me, it's ultimately about, you know, the greatest moments of satisfaction for a CEO, I think, should come 5-10 years after they've left the job. Mm-hmm. And ideally set it up for success after, you know, maybe the culture, the values, some of the leadership principles, ideally they're still in place. And those created a foundation for growth that, you know, didn't need them. Like, to me, and not everybody feels that way, right? Again, like, I think some CEOs self-identify with those four different, you know, kinds of people in a football ecosystem. But to me, the best ones think like 10 years after they left, if the company's doing really well, that is their greatest moment of satisfaction.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor. I like that. It's definitely. Do you think they think about I mean, I guess what I think is interesting is if you presented that to leaders and said which role model or which model do you identify with, if they were aware of that, you know, they might say, oh, well, I don't want to be thought of like that. I don't know. That's very interesting. I like it.
Yeah.
Can you, well, you did share a story, but maybe another story that comes to mind related to somebody in legacy that's come up, you know, in all your leadership interviews, or maybe a theme that has come up about legacy in.
Yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to, not ultimately, but I think one of the most important jobs of a CEO is to identify their successor early, and not, you know, tell people 10 years out, you're going to replace me, but to signal to them, you know, that there's runway in front of them, and if they do their job, and to develop them. And you know, that may sound obvious, but I've been struck by the number of CEOs who frankly resist those discussions, because they work really hard to get the job and they want to stay in the job.
Mhm.
And so they don't really want to talk about succession. And frankly, some boards don't want to talk about it either, because it's like they like Joe or Jane in the chair and they don't want disruption.
Right.
And so that conversation is put off. And there might be, trappings of succession, a pipeline and development and all that, but they don't really embrace that. And I think CEOs have to be talent scouts. Like, they can't outsource that to somebody on their team. Like, they need to be looking for the talent who is ultimately going to take over for them, is going to groom them. And I interviewed this one CEO. She used to run Jack in the Box, the fast food. And I think from like the time she became a CEO, she made it very clear who her successor was going to be, and just spent all her time when she was a CEO grooming the guy who was going to take over for her, because she knew she didn't want to do the job forever, but just saw that as such a core role. And, the pie chart of how CEOs use their time, right? Like, you got to spend at least 10% working with the board and all that, but like in your pie chart as a CEO of how you manage your time, how much of it is like looking for and developing potential successors? Because there's obvious examples in the news, but there's a lot of amazing CEOs who kind of fumbled the ball with the successor, right? And we're quite open about the fact that they made mistakes. And it's a shame to see that, because those CEOs very often work hard to build something pretty amazing, but then
Right.
the performance suffers afterwards.
Right, exactly. Well, I interviewed Bill George,
Yeah.
and he had it's fairly recent, like I want to say in the last 2 or 3 months, just a great article in Harvard Business Review about CEOs and retiring. And
Yeah.
so excellent. Well, I only have a few more questions, so I'm hoping that we see some questions in the chat here in a few minutes. So we've got people listening, so I'd love to have Adam answer some questions in the chat. How do you think people might change how they view or perceive legacy given the pandemic?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, or maybe other changes that you've seen, during the pandemic. But the whole idea of legacy, how they see what they're doing.
Right. I'll answer that question. I think through the lens of people's expectations of companies and their employers. The sort of arc of history is like companies used to just be a job now, right? But in many ways, they've replaced the role of government in our lives in terms of setting policies and our expectations of companies. And I think in this, I think of this crisis as having two big effects of it is magnifying things and accelerating things, right?
Yes.
A lot of the trends in business, remote working, trends in leadership and all those things have been magnified and accelerated. Things that we were talking about like 3 years, it's like it's right now. And I think how people view companies and their expectations of them has been magnified in this crisis. That there's growing demands from in terms of like social movements like Me Too, equality in pay, diversity and inclusion. People have been making more demands of companies, and their reputations have been riding more on those. But in this crisis, I think how companies are responding, that's going to be a factor. People are going to remember what companies did, not only as an employee, like how they treated me, but also just the actions they took in the broader society. I mean, people talk a lot about the ESG movement and sustainability being one of those components, but this has been a moment where the whole notion of sustainability has come into sharp focus because we realize how interconnected the world is.
Yes.
right? Suddenly in many ways, the pandemic has kind of shrunk the planet and sort of magnified. It's like, oh, like all the supply chains of companies and even within the US, and how just we're all so connected, and it's how you treat those relationships.
Yes.
That I think, is, and a lot of the vulnerabilities of the planet, of our society, have been exposed in this crisis, and whether companies see that as part of their responsibility to take on. And the final point I'm making, people have been talking a lot about the whole notion of well-being and mental health, because this has put a lot of strains on a lot of people. I think that's going to be one of the sort of lasting things. I think there's some silver lining there. I think we're going to be traveling on business less. There's going to be less wear and tear, a little more work-life balance. Right now, I think people are feeling a little too much work-life balance.
I know.
Probably some people out there wishing they could go on a business trip just to shake things up. But I think long term, we're realizing there's a way to be busy, be productive, to build business relationships without having to kill yourself on the road.
Right.
So those are just a few things.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Well, I've got one last question, but I do see a couple of questions in the chat here. Here's a question. Do we dare discuss Trump? Okay. And I guess what I will say at the beginning, I'll just say that I struggle with this because, I don't want to talk politics with my graduate students. I don't want to get into, that kind of discussion or debate or whatever. But from a lead, so I really struggle with this because, I honestly don't mention his name, but it's like the opposite of everything I'm teaching, in terms of integrity and character and honesty and authenticity. And in fact, I said to Bill George, I said, because, his book on True North, and I said, what if you're authentically a bad person? And he said, you can't authentically be a bad person. He said, because these are all learned behaviors. You're not born, as an authentic person. So anyway, do you dare discuss Trump? That's a question in the chat. Or discuss maybe leadership.
I mean, I guess it's not that I'm ducking it. It's just I think we could talk about it for about 5 hours, and
Yeah.
I also think that
it's hard to understand it.
Well, it's also, I often use the phrase in leadership, this notion of Rorschach test, or classic ink blots. And I mentioned a previous example of, you show the word strategy to people, and people are going to have different reactions to it, and and think what it means to them. And I sort of feel that way about politics. Like, there's some people who are going to look at Trump and think he's a great leader, and there's some people who's going to look at him and say he's not. And I don't know if this is the right forum for that, so I'm gonna skip on by.
Okay. There's another question here. You kind of touched on, I guess, when you were talking about sustainability, but other thoughts on ethics or social responsibility?
Yeah.
Is that anything you write about in your books?
I think, this is a tough time for a lot of companies. I mean, it's, if you lump all companies and how they've been affected, I'm just going to oversimplify this, but into 3 categories, right? There's, the category of the industries that have been obviously like almost wiped out, certainly
Right.
the hardest hit, like transportation, tourism, right? Then there's the ones in the middle where
entertainment.
Yeah, if you're in the movie theater business, right? Commercial
Or Broadway.
Yes, exactly. So there's all those businesses, and I really feel for them, because all those leaders may want to do the right thing. They may want to hold on to as many people as they can, but if you have essentially zero revenue, it's hard in those moments to say, well, as a company, we want to be our best self, right? Because it's just, you're kind of wiped out. Then there's at the other extreme, there's the companies that are frankly thriving right now. Very often they're digital based, something about the cloud computing or right. Their phones are ringing off the hook and their business expanding. But in the middle, you got companies that are like, parts of their business are struggling and they're, how do we recover? How do we reimagine the business? But I think the through line through all that, I mean, you mentioned the importance of culture, and ultimately that is manifested through, your articulated values and how much of a gap there is between what you say are your values and the behaviors of the leaders, right? And it's in these times that those values are tested. And, even if you have to make the tough decision about laying people off and furloughing, it has to be done within the context of the values. And I think that's a heck of a leadership challenge for people. Like, how do you send that message that it's, ultimately this is about preserving the business, and this has been an incredibly difficult decision, but we're doing it in a way that's in the context of our values. And to me, like, communicating right now, the communication challenge of leadership in the crisis, I think is one of the toughest ones, because it's so much about a balancing act of acknowledging, the reality of the situation while also providing confidence and hope and ideally a bit of inspiration. But, one of the patterns that we've seen over the years is that in times of crises, there's companies that sort of say, we're just going to put our values on hold for a little bit here until we get through this, right? And we've all kind of seen that movie. And then there's other companies that say in times of crisis, well, let's go back to our values, because that will help guide us through this. So again, I've said it before, but this kind of idea of magnification has been one of the outcomes of this crisis. And I think it's, sharpened the focus on values. And it's like, are we really living these?
Right.
Are they guiding us through these difficult challenges? So.
Yeah. And that's why they exist. Those values exist. I don't know if you've read about the letter that the CEO of Airbnb wrote.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bryant, what's his last name?
Chesky. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of gone viral because people are saying this is a great example of communication, focusing on being really clear, providing clarity about values.
Yeah. And I think too, it's, you're seeing different flavors of that as companies are issuing bad news. So, I do some work with Columbia, and we did a webinar and on leading in this crisis. And we had the general counsel of Brooks Brothers on, and she told this, very candid story about how, they were working up. She was talking to somebody about the bad news, because Brooks Brothers retail business, it's being hit pretty hard, and trying to figure out the messaging of that. And one of her colleagues said to her, it's like, can't we just say this stinks? Like, do we need all this kind of like, and she said, yeah, you're right. You know what? This stinks. And sort of, it's that kind of, how do you convey that humanity, that authenticity in this moment? And because a lot of people can get lost behind kind of business speak, and by the time, like, you've got lawyers and comms people, you can kind of massage the humanity out of it. And sometimes you just really need to say, this is awful, and I'm sorry. And I've heard, a lot of CEOs have told me about these moments. There's such a call for humanity, especially because we're all working remotely. And, a couple of stories come to mind. I interviewed Tim Ryan, who's the head of PwC in North America. And he was on a weekly call. He said there was like 40,000 people on the line.
Oh,
He's got 6 kids at home. And he shared with everybody, he goes, look, we had our family blow up moment last Friday night. and he said he got like 300 emails from colleagues just saying, thank you for saying that, because, we're all going through that to some level, right? And just kind of acknowledging that. And another CEO in his home office, he was like wearing a hoodie. And so all the employees said like, nice hoodie. Yeah. So, like just kind of letting that facade down. We're all in this together, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the thing about this crisis.
Right, exactly. Well, our time's kind of coming to a close here, and I always like to ask interviewees, my guests, what should I have asked that you either want to share or that you think people online need to know, or people who will see this during the summit?
Yeah, in terms of big themes about leadership, I think a really underappreciated skill is just the idea of being a good listener.
Mm-hmm.
I often call it the sort of superpower of leadership. And I think there's less and less of it going on in our society with, all our devices and everything else. As you move up in organizations as a leader, it's such an important skill, not just in one-on-one meetings, but you really have to create this kind of like listening ecosystem, because the higher up you go, the more people don't want to bring you bad news, right? It's just human nature, like 2 thumbs up, everything's great, boss. And to not only be a good listener in the moment, but to essentially create like an ecosystem, an infrastructure of listening, where you can get honest feedback from people, from surveys. And Kevin Sherry, who I'm writing my next book with, when he was running Amgen, on every annual survey, one of the questions was like, what do you think of the job that Kevin's doing? And he would say, like, once a year we'd gather all those responses, and as he said, I would sometimes read them with an adult beverage at the side. But you have to bypass the filters that people set up. And I don't see too many courses in business schools on listening, but they should be.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that reminds me of faculty evaluations. It's like, it's so easy to focus on that outlier when everything else is great. And then, and because they're anonymous, you're like, So very good. Well, Adam, I'm honored, and thank you very much. And I always say, the emphasis is on how to make the rest of life the best of life. So may the rest of life be the best for you. And thank you again for those people online. Thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned, because the Leadership Summit will be in June, and details will be on LinkedIn and Facebook and all of those other areas. So thank you very much, and take care. Stay healthy and stay hopeful.
Okay, thank you. Great to connect with you, Jann. Thank you.